As the investigations and indictments in the Murdaugh crime and corruption saga continue, we keep hearing people mention RICO, and they're asking why hasn't RICO been applied to some of these crimes. So we wanted to give everyone a quick breakdown on what we know about RICO and how it might be applied to some of the crime and corruption that we've been seeing today. So first, I'm going to start with a quick history lesson on RICO. RICO is an acronym for the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, and it was passed in 1970 in an effort to make it easier to prosecute and take down criminal organizations like the mafia. Prior to the passage of the RICO Act, crimes committed by members of criminal organizations were prosecuted individually. This was problematic for a number of reasons, but mainly because the heads of criminal organizations don't like to get their hands dirty, and they often delegated the actual criminal acts to those in the lower level of the organization. So those lower level members would be prosecuted and put in prison, and the heads of the organization would just recruit more members to commit crimes, and the crime would continue. In recent years, there have been more instances of RICO being utilized in prosecuting white-collar crimes, and we're going to get into that a little more as well. I'm going to read the U.S. Department of Justice's definition of RICO. It is long, but this is going to be the starting point for how we break it out, so bear with me. So according to the U.S. Department of Justice, it is unlawful for anyone employed by or associated with any enterprise engaged in or the activities of which affect interstate or foreign commerce to conduct or participate directly or indirectly in the conduct of such enterprises' affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity or collection of unlawful debt. The first thing we want to look at are the two key words in RICO, which are criminal enterprise. In order to prosecute a case under the RICO statute, federal prosecutors must prove that a criminal enterprise exists. So what exactly is a criminal enterprise and how do they prove that? Enterprise includes two different categories of association. The first is an enterprise as a legal entity. So we're looking at partnerships, corporations, businesses, or associations. The second is an individual or simply a relatively loose-knit group of people or legal entities that are associated in fact. These latter groups are actually referred to as association in fact enterprises under the statute. So when you see gangs and mafia organizations prosecuted under RICO, often they're being prosecuted using the association in fact. So now that we know what an enterprise is, what makes an enterprise criminal? To make an enterprise a criminal enterprise, four things must exist. First, the enterprise must have affected interstate commerce. So interstate commerce is simply the transacting or transportation of products, services, or money across state borders. Second, the defendant was associated with or employed by the enterprise. Third, the defendant engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. So pattern basically means one crime isn't going to be enough. You have to show a pattern of at least two crimes. The pattern requires that the crimes be related in some way, so we're looking at the same victims, same methods, same participants, or that it's continuous, meaning it was conducted over at least a year. And fourth, the defendant participated in at least two acts of racketeering over a 10-year period. When RICO was first passed, it was intended to break up organizations that were widely understood to be criminal, but as time went on, it became a weapon for federal prosecutors to battle white-collar crime. So it would make sense to try and understand the use of businesses as criminal enterprises. If a business operation, even if it's a legitimate business operation, is used to run an illegal scheme, it can be considered a criminal enterprise. So a legitimate business operation may be a front for criminal activities such as money laundering. The United States Code lists 35 specific crimes which are considered rackets. Now, these include, but they're definitely not limited to, racketeering, including gambling, murder, kidnapping, arson, drug dealing, bribery, extortion, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. A racket is basically a dishonest service which is predicated by a need which has been created by those offering the solution. So an example would be protection money. So let's say a gang is causing all sorts of trouble in a neighborhood and the business owners and residents are in fear. So the gang then approaches the business owners and residents and informs them that, oh, we'll protect you for a price. Now, the business and owners and residents, if they refuse that offer of protection, they have issues. And this is one of the most known organized crime rackets, but there are many, many more. These crimes make up the foundation for the RICO charges. Without the element of racketeering activity, a RICO claim would be difficult to prove. But because one must also prove racketeering activity in addition to pattern, enterprise, operation, management, etc., a RICO claim is going to be one of the most difficult violations to establish. So it's been said that the need to prove racketeering activity essentially requires a plaintiff or prosecutor to prove a crime within a crime, and a plaintiff or prosecutor has no chance of proving the greater crime, for example, the RICO violation, unless they can first establish a lesser crime, for example, an act of racketeering. So the lesser crime is sometimes called a predicate act. Predicate offenses sound confusing, but it's actually a really simple concept. They are criminal offenses that are simply a component of a more serious crime. Mail and wire fraud are the most common RICO predicate acts. To prove a RICO claim based on mail or wire fraud, it must be proven that each defendant in the case intentionally engaged in a scheme to defraud, and then they used interstate mails or wires to further that scheme. So mail and wire fraud are actually one of the two most common crimes charged by federal prosecutors. Both mail and wire fraud require a scheme to defraud the victim of money or property. In other words, the defendant must have deployed a means of deception or deceit, for example, false statements, misrepresentations, or concealment, to deprive the victim of money or property. So the main difference between mail and wire fraud is the jurisdictional hook that allows the Department of Justice to prosecute this conduct as a federal crime. So mail fraud is always going to be a federal crime. Under the mail fraud statute, the defendant must use the U.S. Postal Service or any private or commercial interstate carrier like FedEx or UPS to further the commission of the fraud. But in contrast, the wire fraud statute requires the use of interstate wire transmissions such as email, fax, phone call, text message, or the use of an internet chat room to further the commission of a crime. The key word in the wire fraud is interstate, so it would have to be a wire transmission that crossed state lines for it to be prosecuted federally. Okay, so now we've gone over the key elements of RICO and criminal enterprises. Let's look at the big question. Why haven't Alec Murdaugh and his co-conspirators been charged with RICO? So to do that, I think it's important to look at the indictments and charges that have been levied against Alec Murdaugh and his co-conspirators to date. So right now we're looking at breach of trust with fraudulent intent, computer crime, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Of these charges, the criminal conspiracy would be the one most likely to be considered a crime of racketeering. But to establish a criminal conspiracy under RICO, the prosecutors must prove that the defendant knowingly agreed that a conspirator would commit a violation of one of the substantive sections of RICO, which we discussed above. So the RICO conspiracy provision does not require the commission of an overt act. Moreover, it is settled that the conspiracy offenses may constitute predicate racketeering acts alleging conspiracy. So, for example, a predicate act alleging a conspiracy to commit murder. Now, this is because a RICO conspiracy is not a conspiracy to commit the alleged predicate acts. Rather, a RICO conspiracy offense is a conspiracy to participate in the affairs of an enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. So really what prosecutors need to do is they need to prove that there was racketeering involved in Murdaugh's financial crimes. Did Alec and his co-conspirator offer a dishonest service that was predicated by a need that they created and then offered a solution for? At this point in the investigation, I honestly don't know the answer to that, but given the complexity of his financial crimes, I'm confident that federal investigators are closely reviewing the evidence.